Hello, everybody. Welcome back to the Krulltimate Podcast. I'm your host, Professor Krebs, and oh my gosh, we are fairly freshly back from an adventure overseas. So you may have heard on the previous episodes that there was a special anniversary event being held in the UK for the anniversary of Krull's release. And as we've mentioned in the past, it was released in the US in 1983 on July 29th, but then it was released in the UK December 27th, also in the year of 1983. And so we had this awesome anniversary event that was organized by my friend, Steven Bayman, who you've heard on the show. He and I are going to tell you all about the event, how much we loved it, what happened, what you missed out on, and I don't know, maybe we'll even talk about events in the future that could happen. Steven, welcome back to the show. Thank you for being here today.
Thank you. Nice to see you again, even though it's only been 7
days. It's only been a week since we last saw each other. In fact, at the time that we're recording this, it's exactly 1 week since the event. And I was just looking at your background, and again, you have your UK quad poster up for the film, which I'm incredibly envious of. It's such a beautiful piece of Krull artwork. I absolutely have to get me one of those in the future.
Well, as I said, you never know what Santa will bring.
It just depends on how nice or naughty I've been this year. So
I'm not going to say this like FedEx. I'm sorry.
That's okay. That's okay. In my background, for those who are listening to this audio only, in my background, I have my US 1 sheet, which I took with me to the event. And I'll talk more about that in a little bit. But let's talk about this for a second. So Steven, you had this whole journey of making this event happen in the first place. I almost kind of want to work a little bit backwards. You were putting this together with another event organization group. Can you tell us who you were working with and how that went?
So Misty Moon Events. So it's Stuart and his wife Jen, lovely couple, but I actually physically met them on the day of the event. I met them at the venue. But how that came about was that they came to me on a recommendation. I have a friend called Sarah who is also an actress by profession, and they have invited her previously to at least 2 screenings of films that she's appeared in, including Superman 2 and The People That Time Forgot. And so I thought, light bulb moment, ding, ding, ding. I'm going to go and speak to them to see if they would be interested in putting this on and effectively producing the show. So I reached out to them to say, look, I have these actors and actresses who appeared in this film. There's an interest in this film that is a cult film, and it continues to grow and is a very sort of passionate, devoted audience. Whilst not necessarily hugely mainstream, it's very dedicated and intense, for want of a better word. And so they expressed interest in doing it, and we sort of had that conversation earlier on in the year, because it came not long after Lysette, Graham, Belinda and I were all at London Film Fair. So that would have been, I want to say, November, maybe. I think so. It was, just over a year ago. Maybe a little bit earlier. But anyway, so that's when we'd had we should get together and we should do something, etc. And then sort of goes by the by, except little old me was kind of like, I'm not going to let that go. So that's when I had the conversation with Stuart, who then said, yes, we'll do that. Then it was hitting on a date. We'd thought early summer to go with the US release, but then figured, it might not necessarily attract so much attention. And why don't we hold it back for our autumn to then tie in with what would be the UK anniversary? So then we hit on a date that coincidentally fell around my birthday. And so it was a little bit of a treat. So then everyone sort of put it in their diaries to say, we'll do November 16th. And it came to pass. I can paraphrase Freddie.
Yes. Well, I was very happy when you reached out to me when the tickets went on sale, and it was like, this was given me to know. The tickets go on sale on this day at this time. And and the event was on your birthday. Absolutely fantastic. What a great gift that you gave us on your birthday to hold this event.
it was that was the inconsequential part. I'm sure I shall have many more of them, but it was just a case of no, the spotlight needs to be on this occasion, and yeah, it worked out the way I hoped it would.
So what was it? You're in contact with Lysette and Belinda Mayne and Graham, and you were talking about this. You were kind of like, you were speaking about, oh, we should do this at some point in time down the road. So then it starts becoming a reality. What was it like getting Lysette involved in this event, to get her to committed to this particular event?
A couple of conversations, but because I had sort of brought her round to the film in earlier years, as it were, she sort of got on board with it. And then it was like, oh, we need to get Ken over from LA and so on. I was like, I don't think we have the budget for that at this point. So let's just temper expectations. But, that would be lovely if we could restage something like this and get him over. That was something that she was keen to do, but it was just that I don't have the plane fare for him at this particular point. So this was just, kind of let's test the waters and see how well the response is. And then who knows? There has to be a demand and an interest in it. So I would play it every week if I could. So it all depends on the audience out there as well. And finding people who are willing to host it.
Yes, which we'll talk about in a moment. And then you had to get Belinda Mayne involved. And just for the audience's sake, who did Belinda Mayne play in the film?
So Belinda played Vela, the Changeling. We met at the London Film Fair, as they say, and instantly got on like a house on fire. Lovely, lovely person. And, it's nice to have that extra friendship out of it beyond a professional admiration.
Yeah. And then, what was it like getting Graham on board?
Absolutely cool. I've already said this to him since. I might have said it to you as well. When we were watching the film and he was sat between the two of us, every time it was his scene, I spent more time watching himself to see if there would be some flicker of a memory or a reaction or something to see him looking at 10-year-old self on the screen. But he just sat there, half smiling, just watching it as a normal moviegoer. But it is a very surreal thing to be sat there watching a movie with the person who's in the movie. It was very, it's not the first time I've experienced something like that, but it's very surreal. But between the two of you giggling like little boys over something that I wasn't privy to, and then him just discreetly leaning across about the destruction of the fortress at the end, going, they shot that upside down. And I'm like, well, yeah, I know that. I think I cottoned on to the fact when the boulders are coming down the hillside, I think I visibly saw him sort of move. And I think I picked up a joke that he had done that at the premiere of the film. I wasn't really paying attention to you two at that point. I was watching the film. Because I'm someone who sits there in silence and watches the film.
I'm terrible.
I noticed.
Yeah, actually, what's funny is when we sat down, first of all, leading up to the event, I was talking with Graham and I sent him a message saying, I called dibs on sitting next to you. Because just like you, as a fan of the film and as a fan of Graham, I'm like, this is my one time in my life where guaranteed I have a chance to watch the film with the actor in the film sitting right next to me, and they won't be appalled at the stranger on their left. So I was super excited to be able to watch Krull with Graham Titch McGrath right next to me. And as we sat down, I leaned over to him and I said, so what is the acceptable level of talking at the cinema here? I don't know. And he just kind of like chortled with me a little bit. And then he told me nothing. He said absolutely nothing. I was like, okay, well, here we go. And because I knew for a fact that I was not going to skip the opportunity to ask him about little things in the movie. There's this scene where they're walking through the swamp. And this is after they have lost the seer. And so Titch is the guide. And Ken Marshall's at the front with Graham. They're walking through the trees and stuff. It's a wide established. It's a mid-wide shot, and you can hear Colwyn and Titch talking to each other. And so Titch is like, "It's this way," and Colwyn looks down at him and goes, "Are you sure?" And Titch looks up and he goes, "Yes, I recognize that tree." And so I leaned over to him and I said, I kind of giggled a little bit, and I leaned over and I said, "Was that in the script or was that ad lib?" And without hesitation, he goes, "Ad lib." And so
I heard Graham laugh at that point because I'm like, what's funny about recognizing a tree? So it was, yeah. I wondered what you two were talking about. So yeah, it's, yeah. I recognize this.
I giggled at that line because at least at what's established in the frame and, forced perspective being what it is, it looks like he's pointing at this like fallen log that's just dead and desiccated. He's like, "I recognize that tree." And it just kind of tickled me a little bit.
I didn't realize it was an ad lib, but I just thought he was laughing because he found it maybe corny after all these years. So now I've just learned something today.
Yeah, he at the very least, he seemed quite gracious about the American sitting next to him with our shoulders literally touching almost the whole time. Not that we were cuddling. I mean, I want to tell people we were cuddling, but constantly leaning over to him and making little comments or asking little questions. For whatever it's worth, in my defense, I really did focus on limiting my commentary so as not to disturb others. But I digress.
Was that before or after I leant forward and went, "Shh"?
Actually, I had thought of it prior, but your "shh" absolutely solidified the decision.
Yeah. It's yeah. Again, I think it's a cultural thing because you look at American movies, and if it's in a theater, it's like, for example, the opening of Scream 2,
Mm-hmm.
and they're all running around and they're screaming and they're pretending to kill each other. For a British person, that is a fate worse than death. It's like, if that happens, it is the end of the world. I sort of, this summer when I went to go and see Ghostbusters Frozen Empire, I walked out after about 25 minutes. I couldn't bear any more giggling, talking, people reacting. And I'm like, I've completely lost the plot. I don't understand what's going. The cinema manager caught my eye and she goes, "Is everything all right?" I said, "No, I can't keep up with the film because of all the noise."
Oh.
So she gave me 2 free tickets to go back and see it on another day.
Well, that was nice. That was good.
But it's like, no, if you're watching films, you watch it, you pay attention, you store your questions in your mind, and then you discuss it afterwards.
Well, and that brings us to the next part of the event, because so actually I'm going to back up just one step. I want to tell the audience about where the screening was held, because the venue was just I absolutely adored this venue. Can you tell us a little bit about where this screening was held?
Okay, so it was held at a place called the Cinema Museum in an area of London called Kennington. Now, I knew nothing about it until that day. I just knew that this was the venue, and that they have a couple of screening rooms. But what I learned that particular day was that it had been a former workhouse, and Charlie Chaplin and his mother had lived there, which I had no clue about. But when I was first led into the building before everyone else arrived, and then I'm seeing all this sort of kit film stuff, that you're going, "Ooh, what have I come to?" And it had that old world sort of smell and sort of felt fusty and all that kind of stuff. And then you go upstairs and then it's freezing cold and they've got plug-in oil radiators. You're going, okay, I know it adds to the ambience of the venue. Interesting place. And then I was given the history, and then you go, now I can see it, why it retains its charm.
Yeah.
So it turned out to be a really great venue and fascinating. And the staff couldn't have been more helpful or accommodating, even with a little gong to start the film.
The gong to start the film. What a throwback to classic cinema. Like, that was just absolutely wonderful.
Films,
yeah. To use your expression, it felt very old world, but in the most endearing, charming way. And when we first walked in, as you walk into this building, it's called the Cinema Museum, but it would be hard to tell it apart from most any other commercial building, right? It doesn't particularly jump out as a museum. And you walk
Yes.
through the very ordinary front door, and immediately you're greeted by projectors from across several different eras in film history. I mean, there was one in there that looked like it may have gone back to the very early 1900s. I mean, it was just this gorgeous piece of hardware. There were 6 or 7 of them as you enter. And then nestled in between them is this really modest, teeny tiny, if you have a little bit of spare change, donate. And sure enough, I just happened to have a pound or two in my pocket, so I tossed it in. It wasn't very much to donate at the moment, but I was just happy to participate and to hear it go ka-chink at the bottom. And then you walk through this hallway I realize, again, being a visitor from another country, the sense of American space, of three-dimensional space, is different than most places because we have an enormous amount of space to fill, and we fill it. And in the UK, space is more conservative. So you walk in and you're immediately greeted by all this. And then the hallways are very intimate in their spacing as well. But to your point, on the walls are photographs, not just like prints, but photographs from the 30s and the 40s of film stars and behind the scenes and relics that have been maintained and retained from history. I grew up on Charlie Chaplin, and it wouldn't be until I was a late teenager that I would discover Buster Keaton. And Buster Keaton is by far my all-time favorite actor in history. He is just utterly stellar. So when I saw all of the memorabilia with Charlie Chaplin, who's around that same period of time, I was like, well, I wonder if they have any. Of course, Laurel and Hardy makes a couple of appearances. I looked around. I found one thing for Buster Keaton. I'm sure there were probably more, and there was so much there you couldn't take it all in.
No, that's true.
But I found one thing with Buster Keaton that I just fell in love with. They had a plaster cast of his face, almost death mask style, but not quite. It was prior to his passing. But they had a plaster cast of his face that was hanging in this little nook alongside of some others. I'm trying to remember who else was in there, but they had like 2 or 3 other faces in there. And I took a photo of the Buster Keaton face because I just love Buster Keaton. And then we ascend the staircase into the screening space, and that was that room that you were talking about where Charlie Chaplin and his mother lived. And there's this enormous homage, this in memoriam of Charlie Chaplin, this like shadow sculpture that they made that sits prominent in the center of the room. It's just gorgeous. And then, of course, the room is just absolutely painted with memorabilia from throughout cinema history. So this was an incredible place to hold the film.
Oh, absolutely. I wish I'd had the opportunity to sort of explore it more. You got to take advantage of seeing much more than I did. But I arrived, I was on a mission, I had things to do, so I couldn't pay much attention. So I'm glad that you actually got to experience that and have been able to tell our future audience to this podcast what was available there to see, because I just didn't get the opportunity to fully absorb my surroundings.
Oh, and understandably so. When you're the organizer of an event like this, you're constantly on the move trying to facilitate every moving piece. And most of the guests, like myself, we don't, not only are we not troubled by it, but we benefit from it. And we tend to just see what we receive as opposed to what is put in. And so huge thank you from me and the rest of the audience for making this happen. I will undoubtedly say that more than once this episode. Speaking of, upon arrival, a very pleasant surprise happened wherein I got to meet some of the listeners of this show, which I did not expect.
Yes.
And so a quick shout out to my newfound friends, Asan, Ben, and new subscriber Steve. All 3 of you, thank you very much for coming to the event and for speaking with me and shaking my hand. And for Ben had one of the matching Krull pendants that you and I own. He got his from artist Peter Plant as well, so he already had his glaive pendant, and he brought a glaive replica. So true fan there. Thank you very much, Ben, for being there. Asan and I had absolutely fantastic conversations about the film and about theory and things like that. So thank you to the listeners who showed up to the event. So then we get there, we get sat down, and we watch it once again on the big screen. What was that experience like for you watching it on the big screen? Did you I don't that my instinct is that you weren't old enough, but were you able to see it the first time it was released?
I must have done, because there are just such indelible images in my head that I must have seen it, because I was part of like a kiddies club that we would go to our cinemas, theatre, movie house. We call them
Mm-hmm.
cinemas, and be under the watch of the ushers while your family go off and do what they need to do. So I must have seen it, because I always had this image of the hand and Lissa in it, and then the eye, and then the beast with red eyes, and it's like, I don't know where else I would have had those images come from. I know that I've seen it somewhere, and was on a mission to years later find out what the hell is this film. And yeah, it came from somewhere. I would like to think I saw it on its original release, but yeah, it's I latched on the word Krull. I recognised the poster, which you've got behind you. I knew it had to have come from somewhere, and sort of rediscovered it still as an older child, but still definitely as a child, because then whenever it would be on the TV, I would make a point of watching it. So yeah.
Absolutely. And so now it's back up on the big screen again at this venue, which you made happen. And what was that experience like for you seeing it in that setting as an adult?
Okay, so I actually went to a screening of it. We have a city in towards the north of England called Manchester, which you may have heard of, where they screen cult films at this particular venue. So I'd seen it on obviously it was a giant TV screen. It's smaller than what we watched it on, but nevertheless it was still a large screen, and I'd gone to that, so that was probably 2 years ago, which is probably where people have turned out to come and watch this. I need to do something like this in the future. So I've already seen it on a larger screen. So I wasn't unfamiliar with what I was about to relive. But ultimately, this time it was with a larger audience and with cast members there. So that makes it a whole different
Oh,
experience.
entirely,
But
entirely different.
it's it certainly makes even more of an impression than it does on the small screen. It's a film that deserves to be seen on the big screen, if only just to hear the sublime music from James
Oh,
Horner, which was just, yes. Graham told me that he has the soundtrack on CD and the vinyl, and yeah, so
I still have to get the vinyl.
yeah.
I've listened to it on vinyl because my friend has it. And so that's another on my checklist of Krull collectibles that I have to grab from eBay before they're all gone. But but yeah, the soundtrack is utterly sublime. Utterly sublime. Anytime I'm doing Krull related media work that is not the podcast itself, I often have the soundtrack in the background because it comes with a certain soul, a certain spirit, a feeling of adventure that is not amorphous or abstract, but is particular and specific to the film. James Horner did something magical when he made that score. For all the criticisms that the film gets for being too much like Star Wars, and for James Horner's soundtrack being too much like Wrath of Khan, which was also his work, which is why it is similar, because wouldn't you know it, artists have a signature. Anyway, I digress. For all the criticisms it receives from
Yes.
these angles, the truth is both the film and the soundtrack are unique and distinct in the sum total of their creation. And if nothing else, if the film gets beat up a little bit, a lot of it from social media and things like that, the soundtrack often comes out on top because it's just such a beautiful set piece of orchestral mastery. It's just such a beautiful piece of symphony.
Absolutely. But I mean, I even I remember actually saying last week when the spotlight turned to me, when when they all said "Happy birthday, thank you to Stephen for putting this on," and I turned it back and thanked them for actually giving up their time to come and spend it with us. I do remember saying, regardless of the fact that if the internet were to be believed, it's a flop. It's a rip-off of Star Wars, which I just don't see. I did make a point of stressing that because I can't. Wow, what lasers in one in one battle? Ooh, because they were basically shooting the blasters, but it's not quite the same as the Slayers with their spears that they turn around once they fired the laser. They turn. It's not. I don't see in any way, shape, or form any semblance of being a Star Wars ripoff. It's much more sort of Robin Hood and his merry men. It's almost Excalibur, the Lady of the Lake, going after this legendary weapon, which is obviously the sword coming out of the lake, whereas it's going after the glaive. It's whoever came up with this Star Wars analogy should be shot because, quite frankly, it's not, and it never has been, and it just never is. So I wanted to be very clear when I said that in that room full of people.
Absolutely. And
But yeah,
I thought you said it quite well too. I thought you presented it with real passion, with real love, and there was nothing but the tonality of truth to everything you were saying. I 100% agree with you. I think that it not only besmirches and cheapens Krull, but if anything, I think that it waters down. Star Wars is its own phenomenon, obviously, and it has its importance in both cinema and in the world of sci-fi generally. But Krull does too, and I can't help but have this constant this internal feeling of Krull has a vital place in both cinema history and in the world of sci-fi and fantasy. Only very few people realize it. The truth is there. It's just that not that many people know it yet, and it doesn't change the fact. It's just that it's a fact undiscovered.
Yeah, it's there's these preconceived ideas out there that somebody might say something and it's perceived as truth, which is why it was wonderful to actually have on record Robbie Coltrane was not dubbed. Can we now finally draw a line under it and go, thank you, cast, crew, have all confirmed Robbie Coltrane was not dubbed.
That's absolutely a moment I wanted to hit on 100%. I actually just made a quick note here off to the side because I wanted to talk to you about favorite moments of the event, and I was going to build up to that. So I'm glad that you brought it up. Let me set the scene for the audience, if you don't mind. After the film is over and those in attendance are clapping and we're cheering and we're just absolutely thrilled that we've had this experience, then we take a very short interval, a very short intermission, and then Graham, McGrath, and Belinda Mayne and Lysette Anthony approach the stage and they sit down to have an emceed conversation about the film, after which it was open to Q&A. And there was a wonderful gentleman there who had excellent questions. He had excellent commentary. And I do not blame him for this at all, because it is a commonly misunderstood piece of Krull history. And no matter what we do, we can't seem to squash this. Except in this moment, I think we squashed it for a lot of people.
I think four of us, the three of them up on the stage, plus myself, instantly went, no!
It was one of those things where I had the privilege of sitting in the very front row during the Q&A. And so he was toward the back and he stands up and he has the microphone and he's posing his question. He was talking about Lysette Anthony being dubbed over by American actress Lindsay Krause. And he said, and then also Robbie Coltrane was dubbed by Michael Elphick, which is the piece of Krull history that is erroneous, but just won't die. The moment he said that, as he started talking about Lysette, I was obviously on board. He says that about Robbie. And my eyes got wide and I turned back toward the stage and I was looking at Graham and Lysette. And then I looked over in your direction and I didn't want to be rude because obviously we have superstars up on the stage and I didn't want to cut this man off. And he is about 80% through his sentence when all of a sudden Graham, Lysette Anthony, Steven Bayman, you might have heard of him. They pipe up and they all those voices are just like, no, hang on. Robbie wasn't dubbed. That's a false. But like everyone starts explaining. And then I'm over there in the front row going, yeah. Like, I was just like, yeah, he wasn't dubbed. But of course he can't hear me because they had microphones and they were also, they were the focus. Yeah. All of you are speaking at the same time. And then all three of you go silent at the same time. And he goes, oh, well, I'm actually glad to hear that was just a piece of what do you call it?
I hope he was such a nice chap. I hope he took it in the spirit intended and isn't haunted by the fact that, Princess Lissa and the guy who put it all together all just went, no.
It was such a, but as someone who has known this for some time, and I've talked to you about this, and I've talked to Graham about this, and then you on my behalf, you were talking to Lysette about this as well. Like everyone I've talked to. Oh, and then I've also spoken about this to the son of the producer, Mark Silverman, who's the son of Ron Silverman, because I wanted to get as many points of confirmation as I could, and 100% across the board, no, he wasn't dubbed, and it's obvious he's not dubbed, and yet this thing runs. However, on this topic, I think I may have caught the moment that caused this to happen. Okay, folks, my apologies for stopping the episode. When we were recording this episode together, me and Steven, there was a point at which all of a sudden I lost his video and his audio, and then it came back. And I thought, oh, okay, momentary glitch. Turns out from that point forward, all of Steven's video and audio never actually recorded in the software that I was using. And so it ended up being a one-sided conversation with just my voice and then long gaps of air where Steven was speaking, but it wasn't recording. So I did what I could to go back through the transcript of what I said to remind me of what was spoken about, and I thought I would tell you about the little bits that we discussed before the episode was over. So we were just discussing how Michael Elphick has often been rumored to have voiced over Robbie Coltrane, and when we were watching the movie, I finally heard a small bit of ADR, of voiceover recording that occurred after the fact in the background that said something to the effect of, "Come on, stand still," as he was throwing a saddle on a horse. And that voice does sound similar to Michael Elphick. And it was done in an attitude that matched Run's character. So it's possible, although not confirmed, that Michael Elphick could have recorded that piece of dialogue, although it would have been just as likely that one of the other thieves that were not Torquil or Oswin or Keegan, they could have recorded that bit of audio as well. So it's still kind of unclear. But what we do know for a fact is that Robbie Coltrane's character, by and large, was entirely his voice, except possibly for that one line of ADR. And then we kept talking, Steven and I, for a while about the event itself, and we talked about what it was like as fans of Krull, having those three guests up on the stage talking to us about their experience in the film. Belinda Mayne got a chance to speak a little bit about being Vela, and she spent a little bit of time on stage, or on the sound stage, I should say, working this character and doing her stellar performance. But most of the work that she did ultimately ended up on the cutting room floor. I got a chance to ask her about that a little bit later in the evening, and while I wanted to get some more details about that, and she didn't share any at the time, but there is hope for a future conversation. We can talk about that some other time. But then Graham, of course, spoke about his experiences, and he talked about the tiger. Everyone wants to know the tiger story, and understandably so. But really, the crown jewel of the evening was listening to Lysette Anthony talk about her experience working on the film. And in truth, much of what she had to say had to do with her frustration with the process, had to do with the difficulty of the process, had to do with how things were constantly in flux and in change, and the kind of impact that had on her at such a young age as an actress. She was only about 18-ish when she made the film in the first place, and she was used to certain levels of organization in the production, and in this case that just was not present, and what a different experience that was for her. She talked about that quite a bit. She talked about her abiding respect and love for Ken Marshall, who chose to leave the limelight to focus on being a father and raising his children, one who has special needs. It is impossible to overstate the respect that she holds for him. She went on quite humorously about some of the things that happened outside of the film and after the film was made, and it was a very interesting sort of reminiscence on her part, and she got the lion's share of the time to talk about those things. So between those three individuals speaking about their experiences on the film, it was an absolute treat for fans like you and me. And then after the Q&A session was over, it moved into a meet and greet where we got to spend a little bit of time, actually quite a bit of time, with each of the special guests that were there. Belinda Mayne had to leave pretty shortly thereafter, but she stayed for about 20-ish minutes or so. And I got a chance to stand next to her. I had no idea how absolutely petite she is in real life. And I also learned something about her. She grew up in a household that spoke German because her father is German. And she had many opportunities to perform in German cinema. And so she went over to Germany and did a number of films speaking gorgeous German. And unbeknownst to her, until we started talking, I speak conversational German to a very amateur degree, but I love speaking the language, and I am usually very shy about exercising my German with other people. I like practicing it. I have a very hard time speaking it with other humans because I get really embarrassed at sort of my, childlike level of speaking. But she was very calm and patient and kind and generous, and we got to speak German with each other for just a very small period of time. And she asked me in German how I learned and where I studied and things like that, and we talked about that for a little bit, and then we reverted back to English very quickly because my vocabulary is so limited. But we had a great time speaking with each other. She signed my one-sheet poster, which was a signature that I did not have, and I was so stoked to get. I also got her to sign a very special photo that contains her and Graham and Lysette at the first Krull event where they reunited for the first time in 40 years. So that was an exceptionally wonderful piece of Krull memorabilia to acquire on this trip. Then Steven and I, as we talked about this event, we reminisced about how we got to spend time. He was mostly working with Lysette and trying to get fans through and getting signatures. Graham spent time with me. Belinda spent time with me. And then ultimately Lysette spent time with me, and quite a bit, actually. Since I was on the inside, as it were, with Steven and Graham and Lysette, I was able to stay back while they were shutting things down. And I got to spend copious amounts of time with Lysette and Graham. And it was... the word that I keep using to describe it is gift. It was such a gift. Between the criticisms of the film in the first place and now with actors going through some very serious health situations, having any number of them at this event, having this event at all, was entirely a gift. Almost approaching miraculous, because how many places are going to support activities like this for this film? Well, it turns out that the more of us, the fans, that show up, the more likely it is that these events will continue to happen, and happen in grander spaces and in larger quantities and with larger audiences. Steven was telling me how he was glad for those who showed up. He was a little crestfallen that there weren't more in attendance. And I totally understand that feeling. I shared with him an experience I had where I had conducted a fan panel during September of 2023, which was the 40th anniversary year, at the local major nerd culture event here in Utah called FanX. And I was hopeful that I could get 50 people, maybe even 100, because with a population of literally tens of thousands, there have to be at least 100 Krull fans. And we got somewhere in the neighborhood of about 30 people. And it was a smaller group than I had anticipated. And I was feeling that same way. I was feeling kind of crestfallen. And as we were sort of meeting with each other after the panel, the panel's only an hour long, and afterward we were meeting with some of the people who were there, and they were very happy to be there and shaking hands. And I made some comment about I really thought we would get more people, and I'm glad for the people who showed up. I thought we would get more than what we got, but I'm glad that we got who we got. I'm glad that we got you. I didn't want to besmirch the fans who were there, of course. I didn't mean it that way. I just wanted to see more faces. And one guy who was in attendance, one gentleman who attended the panel, said to me, well, you know what, with movies like this and with fan bases that love movies like this, you don't always get a lot of people, but you always get the right people. And I thought about that and I was like, oh man, he's absolutely right. Even this event in England, we had somewhere between 40 and 50 people in attendance. And it wasn't a lot of people, but every single person who was there was in love with the film. And we all got to share that with each other in a concentrated group, the size of which we likely hadn't been involved with prior when it comes to Krull. And I was so thrilled to think about that while I was in England with these super fans. It was fantastic to be amongst our people. When I did the charity event in July of 23, my buddy, who is a co-host on the other podcast that I host called Dungeon Crawlers Radio, he got a chance to watch the film about a year prior to that because we were doing an anniversary episode, and he had many criticisms for the film itself in terms of its storytelling, in terms of its pacing, and how it holds up today and things like that. And I understand his criticisms, I do, but I constantly barrage him with all the things I love about the film and why. And then he came to the charity event and he saw it on the big screen with my poor man's remastery that I made for this event. And after he saw it on the big screen, after the event was over, he said, I've made it obvious that I'm not a big fan of the film, but now that I've seen it on the big screen like that, I get it. I get why people love this movie. It really does belong on the big screen, not at home. This is a spectacle for the cinema. And I thought that was one of the greatest compliments anyone could give any film, especially a film that is undervalued, like Krull. So, we didn't get that many people at the London event, not as many as we had hoped, but everyone who was there was the right person. And we got to see it on the big screen because Krull is a spectacle for the cinema. And we got to spend quality time with 3 vital actors to the production. We got to spend time with the boy apprentice. We got to spend time with the changeling who nearly killed Colwyn. And we got to spend time with the princess and queen of the entire planet, Lysette Anthony herself. What a marvelous gift Steven Bayman and Misty Moon Productions and all those involved gave us, the fans, that night in Kennington. So thank you guys very much for hanging out with me as I wrap up this episode solo. Steven, I'm sorry we lost the additional content, but man, what a great conversation you and I had. And I hope that I have done this summary justice. Thank you so very much for joining me as we wrap up season 1 of the Krulltimate Podcast. We'll take a short hiatus as we get into the new year, and then we'll start dropping episodes for season 2. Thank you so much for being part of this show. Stay absolutely, ardently huge fans of Krull, and we'll talk to you next time. Thank you so very much for listening to this episode of the Krulltimate Podcast. Now, I would like to hear from you. If you have any questions, curiosities, or comments that you would like to make about this or other episodes, you can send them to thekrulltimatefandom@gmail.com. Until next time, I have been your host, Professor Krebs, and this is the Krulltimate Podcast.